social change. When the man is busy making niggers, it doesn't matter much whose shade you are. If he runs out of one particular color, he can always switch to size. And when he's finished off the big ones, he'll just change to sex, which is, after all, where it all began.
Diaspora as a cultural force. There's a cafe in the back if you'd like some tea or something to eat. I should say that Triple Canopy is a magazine. We also present events like this, all of which feed into or emerge from our publishing program. Most everything we do is free, so if you appreciate this series, I encourage you to find one of us and consider becoming a member or donating to support the work that we and our contributors are doing. I think that's it. How are the projections? Great. Okay. Everything is sounding and looking beautiful, so I think we'll get into it. Thank you very much, and I'll hand it over to Ryan. Thank you.
Something that's for you.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
yeah,
Wow, what a treat.
You got it. Okay, so how these have been finding themselves to be beginning is through some readings, maybe a guided quote. This time I have a guided quote, a short essay from Samela Lewis from the preface of Black Artists on Art, and then there's a sort of response to that, which is called Creole Images. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll get into whatever we find. Black Artists on Art is intended to introduce the works and thoughts of a selected number of producing Afro-American artists. Traditionally, it is customary to approach a subject of this nature with some historical justification. I have, however, decided to depart from this tradition because I feel that honest creative expression needs no history or justification. Many will be surprised to discover the large number of truly creative individuals who are participants outside of the mainstream of art in the United States and the Western world. The fact that these artists are generally unrecognized is not because they are ignored, but because they are seldom observed. The aesthetics of a people is directly tied to the mainstream of their existence. This assumption is a natural consequence which could give rise to resourceful creativeness. Resourceful creativeness that could provide for differences that might serve as vital accents in the total human scheme. However, one finds that in the United States, the quote, European-style aesthetics, end quote, commands the art world. Most other cultural orientations are deemed primitive, quaint, or suspect. The adaptation of this European-imposed style of aesthetics may be regarded more as ancestor worship rather than a valid system of aesthetics. A truly valid system of aesthetics should be derived from the culture of its inhabitants and should reflect the prevailing spirit of the times in a manner that involves all groups residing within the society. This direction would provide a concept of relationship that would include both commonalities and differences. Since it is the differences that sharpen or give vitality to the commonalities, it would seem that the necessity of a culture to accept and respond to such diversities is a requisite to creative production. Many pages could be written concerning art and its relative importance from a cultural standpoint. It can be briefly stated, however, that the control of this cultural empire is 99 and 100% from the white group. This is not because whites are more cultured, but because they control the economy and consequently dictate the specific aesthetic standards. This condition will persist so long as we continue to follow their prevailing, archaic, computerized style of aesthetics, insisted upon by those in command. It is without question that the present operations of, quote, the world of art, end quote, functions in the manner of a closed society. Next is Creole Images, and it is giving reference to the two pictures behind me. The beautiful contradiction of simple in form and rich in meaning. Clearly different auras radiate from each image. On the left, there's a loud hunger for precision, dominance, symmetry, and isolation. On the right, a quiet conversation with local natures. A deal is made on the occupation of form and function preceding personal aesthetic desire. The image on the right thrives in the failure of reproduction, as it not only points at something, but becomes its own subject under the collapse of signification. If this were an artwork and not a grave, it might be titled Unidentified Slab. It might mean something, but it's also just a slab. This shines in the same light of a juke joint performing as a space of comfort without the fear of reaching some visual standard set prior. That desire laid bare by using what's around finds itself close to some pure essence. The image on the left is a foggy day, date unknown, could be tomorrow, in Jackson Square in New Orleans, Louisiana. Cameraman's back to the Mississippi, towards a centuries-old French settlement flanked by West Indies, native palmetto trees on either side. A Spanish cabildo trying its damnedest to try to penetrate atmosphere, and in the center, perspective, lies the form of a white Carolina man taking shape as the ultimate representation of the American scheme. The image starts to act in similar textures and tones of an early Disney animation frame. You can almost hear the marching band theme played bombast for jokes. The strictly European system, in the variation of American bigness, is a cheap trick that seems to merely mimic creative expression. It says less about something and more so tries to get exactly at a singular prescribed idea drive, centric uniform expansion. Europe's forms act in desperation and obedience of a simple appetite. Better is always ahead. Resolution, reduction is power. Linear progression, good. Symmetry, good. Angles are interesting as long as they support the perspective. Ours. These are a Cartesian people of X and Y axes, Euclidean rank and file society on full display. Counterpoint and harmony before rhythm. A factory civilization historically investing in object-oriented programming. Their signs of empire express this want obnoxiously so. But what expression can be found yours in pure symmetry? It's the most obvious choice in front of us all. At the same time, it's rarely found in nature. The gesture of systemic material consolidation transforming to abundance, for example, corporate bankruptcy, mass-scale extractive mining, 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, is rarely found in nature. The claim can be made that European ideas might not be of Earth insofar as such ideas are antagonistic to the space that they are placed in. These ideas being the basis of their expressive vernacular might be residue of their internal psyche, which capitalism finds itself downstream of, floating lazily down the same river as the image on the left treads dutifully beside. Both vestiges of a deadly appetite the rest of the world has the disservice to violently accommodate. In time, this pestilence has shifted into a global death knell. This is already evident in the environment both seeds physically reside in. It may be worthwhile to see the pre-modern signatures of white nature in simpler terms before tackling their bigger machines centuries in the making. They have learned to dissuade many people from seeing its true face. A loud, false importance lying flaccid behind something called complexity within a structure called business and an implied reality called the city. On the right, jazz trumpeter Bunk Johnson's gravesite in New Iberia, Louisiana. This image understands the failure of permanence as an idea. That complex form lose themselves in their signatures as time expands onward. If you can't beat them, join them. There's a positive beauty in watching a sign willfully collapse under its own form. The contradiction becomes a strength, a simple song carrying its tune longer than a 5-part movement. General expression may be more clear than complex articulation. It asks you to join in the meaning making rather than dictate its meaning to you. The blues imbued in physical space. Something to consider about this is the simple failure of a low-resolution object is that resolution was a moving target that changes subjectively with space-time, or at least there's a distance between how signifying behaves in modernity than before. And to feel that difference because we find ourselves in a time with the ability to observe what happens to various community psyches when we condense these images that come from two very different times into one place is worth investigation, as these traditional communications and counter-communications are happening to and around us, whether we realize it or not. By deciding what you think is meaningful and contributing towards external expressive transfer, art, under stipulation, some outside the tradition might call these limitations, which gestures end up being chosen tells so much about yourself and the world around you, more than if you had the reign to say everything you wanted to with any material, regardless of its proximity to your world. As it has not yet been granted the means to hide behind the fog of fidelity realism, for example, the capture of photorealism, solely representational figuration. Documentation of earnest desire is the goal for those who want to learn the full spectrum of ancestral embodied knowledges, including their enemies, as to clearly not be lost in the tricks of the spectacle modern world, a three-dimensional reproduction of a colonialist desire. Quote David Hammond's 1986. I just love the houses in the South, the way they built them, that negritude architecture. I really love to watch the ways Black people make things, houses, or magazine stands in Harlem, for instance. Just the way we use carpentry. Nothing fits, but everything works. The door closes. It keeps things coming through, but it does have that neatness about it, the way white people put things together. Everything is a 32nd of an inch off, end quote. The Black American vernacular is one of gossip. about that. So briefly, you told me that this was coming from your dad's place of birth, same city. Did I catch that?
Yeah, we're having a funny sidebar, but
Wow. Yeah. I got you.
hello? Okay, there we go. How about that? Yeah, Ghostwriters, Objects in Mirror. Funny enough, this is one, I don't know, way back in the day when I was getting the records, you used to find like in any record shop in Philly, because it was produced in Ambler, Pennsylvania, which just happens to be the town where my dad like grew up. But yeah, it was a really commonplace record, but you know, you get into techno or other types of music and all of a sudden you put it on all these years later. It was recorded in 1981 with the Bushless synthesizers. You know, has a whole fresh, you know, listening to more current music adds a whole perspective to this music.
Right.
In 1980 or whatever, I thought I'd bring it out. So.
And completely demolishes the idea of like singular origin when it comes to certain ideas or a canon. You know, these examples come out from the margins. Maybe not for you, like you said, this was abundant, but.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm a big believer in time travel, so to speak, and that and tones. It's all very, for me, non-linear, and we find the sort of, at least when I find the sort of evidence of,
Right.
you know, I mean, ideas that we think of, you know, being, you know, very recent, and finding that sort of evidence in the past is always like very exciting. For something like this, it's doubly exciting because it's not only like evidence of something, but it actually still has possibilities for the future, at least when I hear it, you know, so really, really something.
Well, I know we just got into it, so maybe we should do it. It's not a digression, but let's just keep going around the circle. Tell me a bit about yourself, what you do, please share with the class.
Well.
What you're up to.
Oh, before I forget, we
Yes.
have to backtrack. You played, started off with a track from Dilla's Rough Draft.
Yeah, Nothing Like This. Really beautiful tune. I think Stone's Throw was kind of the first label I really got into. I was on the forums a lot, STMB message boards. I was really a kid, but I just dove deep into Dilla, Madlib. My brother went to like Los Angeles for like his 16th birthday. He asked our mom, like, I just want to go to LA, I want to go to Fat Beats, I just want to go to the record store. And we did that. We also went to a Gnarls Barkley concert, which is interesting. But no, exactly, yeah. In fact, I think it was Nelson the Mask that like first put me on to do when he was on Adult Swim. I think I saw some music video and I was like, what is going on? Right. So I think you really get, you know, kind of shown, not a eureka moment, but something that changes you, where you're like, oh, there's other ways to organize music, there's other ways to organize ideas, and I think Dilla, Madlib was that sort of epiphany moment for me, that there's a different syntax to go about expression, back to non-linearity, which I just wanted to ask for you, what if you can pinpoint a moment, a person, a song, a period that kind of loosened up some Western epistemologies for you?
Wow, so much. Well, first of all, you know, it's funny, you're saying, you know, what am I all about, your question. And we went back to the Dilla thing, which then went to Madlib. And for me, that's like the jumping off point for everything. For me was, when I first was introduced to The Unseen, like Madlib's The Unseen, a really great album that was released, I want to say in '99, was really big in the early aughts, really big. But the way he was dealing with samples, I just never heard before. In fact, funny that I actually had all these Madlib records and samples in my box. Was like, you know what? That's not. I don't want to go there tonight because it'll be the whole conversation.
Right, we'll get stuck.
But you brought me there anyway with this record. But in any event, that was a big one. But I would say the moment for me, I can tell you exactly what it was I remember my first favorite song was a Scenario track called Quest, which came out, I was probably about 12 years old.
Great
But
video.
it was the first time I insisted on having, I got the cassette at the time, but owning a physical copy of media and having that. And then later on I started getting into vinyl because at the time that was the cheap alternative to CDs and other types of physical media. And so I remember getting this Art Blakey record and putting the record on and hearing the sample, like doom, 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 you know. And not only hearing the sample, but if you put the album side by side, it's like the cover art's very similar, very reminiscent of one another.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things where it suddenly clicked that, you know what I mean, we're kind of moving through this sort of spiral with sound and tone and connecting to elders and ancestors without even realizing it. And that we're like kind of, building whole kind of worlds on top of this bedrock.
Right. Yeah, it's very sort of like, it's like a cosmic ecology, or it's very like ecologically sound in terms of what sampling is doing. It's kind of this reduce, reuse, recycle type of thing that the more we spin it back around, we recognize that something has to change for it. This sort of changing same going on over and over again. Sometimes it's going towards abstraction and this kind of minimalism, which we can get at through Detroit, or in other places it might grow even more abundant, but maybe like in Philly with the use of horns. I'm thinking about, what are those cats' names?
Gambling Hub.
Gambling Hub.
Yes, the Philly Sound.
Yeah, the Philly Sound.
International record.
It gets so large, they really want to fill up the space. But either way, it's looping on this kind of sense of recursion, iteration, ornamentation. So yeah, the circle, like you said, really does become a bit of a spiral. Which brings me to the iterative nature of your own work. So two pieces that I saw and were the one that's currently up at MoMA, if I'm not mistaken.
Hammer Museum in Los
Hammer
Angeles.
Museum, excuse me.
It's okay. It was at MoMA a couple weeks ago, so
Okay.
that's not close.
Fair enough. Isis and Osiris and The Inheritance, which came out in 2020. Both seem to be interested in kind of the continuity of care through iteration, but also trying to relinquish this idea of kind of a human scale of time and in history. Maybe you just talk to everyone a little bit about what Isis and Osiris is, and we can get into some ideas of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Isis and Osiris is my most recent film, and it's not a part of a series per se, but it's one of several films I've made either in collaboration with or thinking directly about specific, I'll just say for the sake of conversation, jazz musicians. And so this piece was commissioned to be put into a show dedicated to Alice Coltrane, which is playing, that shows up in LA at the Hammer Museum, Monument Eternal, Alice Coltrane. And so, funny enough, I was given a sort of prompt, which was architecture in relation to Alice Coltrane. I didn't really know what to do with that, but initially I was going to shoot a piece in the house that Alice Coltrane lived in with John Coltrane, where he composed The Love Supreme, and where she actually, I didn't know this until I started doing my research, but she recorded her first 5 LPs in the basement of that house. So those, early Alice Coltrane records that we all love, all recorded in her basement. And I was spending a lot of time thinking about like what would take this up, that studio, etc. It turned out that we weren't able to shoot in this space. However, we were able to work actually with Alice's harp, the original harp that she had given to her by John Coltrane. And so I was able to also partner with Brandy Younger, who's kind of young interpreter of Alice's music, and go into a studio and make some recordings with this harp that John Coltrane had built in 1967. And so that's the kind of recent piece, but I really centered it on the sort of materiality of the harp itself, as well as the architecture of the recording studio. And as far as this issue of time, the harp is a great example. To spend time with that harp, hours on end, hearing a master harpist activating this, there's a presence there that, to me, the idea that I'm dealing with a dead spirit or something from I'm dealing with the presence, and this idea of time as it interests me in music is, that, especially something like, music, modern music, this music from 1980 to today, it's such a blip, But the marketing of music will have you think, you know, every week there's a new genre coming out, and somehow EDM is something different than some other thing, you know, this sort of thing. And it creates this feeling. So with my work, it's always, you know, trying to connect, you know, what we think is brand new to something else.
Right.
Where I feel like Dill is very relevant in that sense. I mean, that's for me a lot of the jumping off point, being very excited about what someone like Dill is doing, particularly with Donuts. But then realizing, you know, not then realizing, but realizing that it's also built with so many samples and wanting to go back. And so, you know, that moment when he's sampling, you know, Frank Zappa or something like that, to me that's like collapsing time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's if anything, it's collapsing, you know, presuppositions of time, where time is, to me at least, it's much more of a spatial thing, at least in the kind of dimensionality that we understand it. And so the way that, you know, Dilla can place Zappa and some like kazoo orchestra band and Frank and Tank on the same song or something like that, it's already happening, you know. It only feels, I mean, in a way it's magical and beautiful, but it's also a very possible process. It's also here. And so the idea that time is something that's compartmentalized or put into closets of decades and eons of years, it's kind of a bit of a facade. And then to get away from that entire understanding, like you said, it happening in a blip, I think it's important to try to understand a deeper, you know, geologic sense of time, where the past, for a geologist, the past like 3,000 years is literally instant. Like that's an instant amount of time, because you have to grapple with 4.54 billion years. What becomes, you know, an eon or a millennia is a speck, you know. And so to think about this idea of ancestor worship, like I was bringing up in the preface earlier, I found myself having to kind of stop myself at the door watching that short, because for a moment I was feeling that kind of, you know, ancestor worship, like imbued in the object or the materiality of Alice's heart. But then when we were speaking before this, I had to kind of like take a second and be like, that wasn't very long ago. And although she's not currently with us in this, you know, this current realm, the idea that, I don't know, there seems to be a more transitory nature between elder and ancestor. And does it happen immediately? Does that take even more time for us to like consider what an ancestor is, or is the harp really, is it present here with us as much as you are, or, you know, Brandy was?
Yeah, I mean, from my, again, point of view, yeah, just even the conversation, to invoke someone by name in a space right here and now is, you know, to bring that, you know, present, you know, make it relevant again, you know. And so, again, whether that's music or anything else, it's like, you know, whether it's Dilla sampling something or your next track, you know, being a selection from 1950, whatever, that we're in that moment, you know, in that time. You know, one of my favorite musicians, you know, hopefully they come up in some part of this conversation, is a lot of people's favorites, the Sun Ra Orchestra, right? My very first film in terms of this jazz tradition was made with them, and that was 2007, and at the time, Marshall Allen, the band leader, he was 87 years old at the time, and the band members were talking about, you know, like Marshall's getting up there in age, how many more years do we have with Marshall, and why it's so important to see him, because he literally is the last human being who like came from the big band, like Errol, who still leads a big band, right? It's like you can't, when you go to see someone like that perform, he still performs at 101, he's bringing all of that. Like when you see these bands, I was at his 100th birthday concert, everyone there and crying, sobbing, they're playing big band music from 1935, you know, but it all felt so present in the moment. He took us somewhere, you know, so this nonlinear time thing, especially with someone like Sun Ra, we love to talk about Afrofuturism, but when you're dealing in nonlinear time, it cuts both ways. It's like we could also go back 100 years, go forward, you know.
Yeah.
It's all there in music. Like this record in 1981 was taking us to 2025, sitting here on this couch.
I feel like there's a song that speaks to this in a really exciting way. It's a song by Suburban Knight, who was, I would say, the second wave of Detroit techno, but was there at the beginning. Just really doesn't get his props as much as he should. And he has a song called Shapeshifter. It's the first song on his I think his debut album that came out like in '03. It's called My Soul, Dark Direction. Really great. And the tune is called Shapeshifter because for him, black music really isn't changing any of its ideas necessarily, it's just changing different shapes through whatever technology it's in. So for him, he's thinking about this one bar, I believe in Detroit, it's called, I think the Black Bottom Bar, if I'm not mistaken. They're repairing it right now. I'm gonna check my phone while this song plays. But yeah, maybe think about while this is going on, the idea of the Detroit Club, the Music Institute, Marble Bars kind of being basically a neo-juke joint where the aesthetics might be different, but the architectures are still as old as they are future.
Shapeshifter. 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 Shapeshifter.
some ways, I'll say more sophisticated kind of versions of techno. It made me immediately think of kind of window of time when I started to get deeper into music, and a lot of people kind of around 2015 or so. And around that time, I guess we keep going back to Stone's Throw somehow, some way.
I think so.
It keeps going back, but I don't know if anybody was deep into the sort of Dame Funk era, To Each His Own, and all the stuff he was releasing around that time, kind of post G-Funk bedroom production kind of sound. But he made these really interesting EPs around 2014-15 that he was releasing independently, no hype, but they're all called Architecture, and that was one of the tracks. And they all, for me, feel very techno-inspired, and I was interested in this idea, the way you're talking about kind of space shape-shifting, right? That could be like the physical self shape-shifting, but then there's also the idea, right, that you're saying where the music itself is somehow redefining space or shifting things around. And so I guess for me that was also a bit of a prompt in terms of this idea is the sound itself, there's an architecture to its design, and that's the name, and maybe that's a part of it, but that I'm also thinking a lot about the way that in a space like this, the architecture is literally changing, right? The walls are vibrating, everything's moving in relation to the sound, and these tones are maybe meant to shift in that way. So that was kind of where your track took me.
I feel you. I do like to think about music as if it's a liquid architecture or some kind of wake of a force of an idea, and then all you have to sit with is kind of the impact that it left you, and not really the material of a wall, but kind of the idea of a form. And sometimes that subversiveness, at least to me, feels like there's a lot of potential inside of how a song might, whether through syncopation or lack thereof, help you think about how you situate yourself in space. You know, like how it might entice you or incentivize you to move your hips or your legs or your toe or your head. You know, like that to me is a kind of a guiding architectural form through drum, which ultimately, and I don't know how many of y'all are reoccurring of these events, but I've been using this or hearkening this Sylvia Winter quote, Caribbean theorist, where she talks about the drum and its use in Africa as a tool or an instrument for consciousness reversal. And to me, that really feels pertinent with, I would say, music in general. I have some, Louisiana, basically work camp productions where they're using song for the pickaxe to like really help mediate the imposition of basically the carceral nature that is the American South that we are seeing happen on display. But yeah, even then, it's not necessarily a salve. It is a framework to help not just cope, but to insist on another way to be. And I think the drum is very, very important. But also I want to talk a bit about home. I want to return to the drum, and I will with the song, but I do want to talk about home, and architecture is brought up, because it feels like in your works, the idea of home, both in the formal and in the kind of the immaterial, the conceptual, seems to be a reoccurring topic for you. I'm speaking specifically about The Inheritance, a film that came out in 2020 that is fictitious but also historical, but you're blending the lines between documentary but also journalism. It takes place in Philly, and there are actors, but at the same time, there's also many of the descendants from the Move collective that are present and speaking, so it also continues as like an oral history. Tell me a bit about that, and even how that idea that you put together also kind of throws away this idea of a linear idea or a genre, a topic of this is a narrative or this is a fiction.
Sure, I mean, for me, it's always been that way, where all art has been fluid. Like my interest, my main interest artistically growing up, or not even growing up, but once I started to take art seriously, it was in music, sample-based production, DJing, this sort of thing. And when I discovered filmmaking, it was from not so much, desire to become like a certain kind of filmmaker, but that I love cinema, but I was learning how to make music on a computer at this point. I was using something called Reason, great program, when it was kind of new. And the grid system of making music, when I was, shocked the first time I sat down to edit video, and it's the same, it's a very similar grid system. You're just dealing with a grid, right? One way or the other. And so I started to literally just take my ideas about editing music together and apply it to cinema. And then you start adding to that different kind of modes of nonlinear storytelling, et cetera. And so for me, I was almost trying to think of the inheritance almost like a mixtape or a set, and a set that kind of has themes that you kind of get away from and you kind of come back, you get away from and you come back, but that it was more music, was something that rotates as opposed to moves, like literature in a straight line, down the line to the end. It's like it's a back and forth and around sort of thing. And for me, why I think I chose moving image as my primary field is because I think it's just a really comfortable way, or it's not comfortable at all. When it's all said and done, when the process is over, I think it's the best way for me to share with other people how my mind works. Not necessarily what I'm thinking, but how I'm thinking, in process, which everything is, again, these circles, these cycles. But the professor in me can't help but get into these topics sometimes where, I don't really believe in nonfiction. I don't believe in that kind of reality at all. Like it doesn't.
Say more.
It doesn't exist for me. In that, when we're talking particularly moving image culture, which is to say, even though I have, just as an example, moved people coming in and doing those parts, it's like I shoot all my films on analog film, so it's like, okay, we have 10 minutes to do this take, I need this story, let's do it, And so, sure, everything they're saying is true, but it's someone performing themselves on camera for the sake of my film, and that's really not much different than the actor that's performing a certain type of emotional truth that I really need and being instructed in the same way. And then to take that out of a film into the moment, here we are, we're all performing ourselves all the time, and that performance, it's not based on reality. I mean, contemporary politics, if it shows us anything, is that people are more inclined to accept myth and storytelling over facts and hard evidence. So reality is a byproduct of a fictive situation that we derive our ideas from, which brings me back to something I feel like we must talk about at some point, especially as you're talking about the drum and Sylvia Winter, and I'm thinking clearly you're someone who places, pressure is not the right word, you have high expectations for music. Some people it's just a form of entertainment. I don't know, maybe to be clear, but clearly not for what you're doing, not for what I'm doing as well, but that there's this, I wonder how coming up in a religious context with music kind of impacts the sort of thinking about music in this way. And again, the way it relates to me with this sort of mythological universe, it was like I came up in a context also kind of religious, not kind of very religious, where what happened in that church context was way more real than, my experience of learning history, right? Who never told a lie? Abraham Lincoln. I don't even know, right? That never felt real to me. It's like the people kind of, catching the Holy Spirit in church, that was very real. It's like, what's providing them with that energy? A story that, may or may not be true, but essentially we're dealing with, things that go so much far beyond ordinary concepts of reality.
Again, another Winter quote comes to mind, the actualization of metaphor, and I think the Black church in general is just, and really Black music becomes like an ongoing project of actualizing the idea of metaphor, or insisting that metaphor is as real as whatever we consider reality. And then coming back to my own beginnings, I was in the choir, and so I kind of played a sort of voyeuristic role on watching watching the situation of Southern Baptist Church happen. I was kind of behind the pastor, and to the left of me was the band, which was basically a rock band, you know, with a Hammond organ on top of a synthesizer, full drum set, kit, bass, rhythm guitar, and of course there's various tambourines, which is almost akin to like people bringing whistles to the club, or flags being, it was just so, brilliant in terms of how striking the whole situation was. And trying to recognize that it was really music being the vehicle of transcendence, of trying to get people from whatever situation that they were in, and then vying for that moment, that kind of split from reality where they might end up speaking in tongues or going on victory laps. One playing a role in that was special, and I kind of recognized already not the responsibility, but the kind of lineage that I was in, because this is also a very old thing going on. But also I just saw that that it had a use case, that it had a knowledge system attached to it, but it also had a material, almost medicinal quality to it that really helped people. And I think why my expectations, I love how you put that, the expectations of music that I have for it comes from not out of the blue, or partially my own desires, but also my own experiences. And then kind of watching, at least in my own experience, the kind of black church start to veer closer to some kind of Christian nationalism. It's like no longer trying to encode black struggle in itself, and using, biblical allegory as a means to see where you are right now. It's gotten way too abstract, where it ends up just being about money or engagement or grifting, and that's really sad. And so maybe I found a new church in the ideas of techno, where it's really trying to use the same way that I'm thinking about New Orleans, how kind of brass instruments after like the war, I don't know, 1812 or something, they were kind of around them there in the opera house. And so initially it was kind of jug and bone players playing in the street, but then they pick up these brass instruments and start to reorganize through reassemblage. And I think they were kind of neglected or forgotten, and I think people from techno who were either in the Motown studios or coming right out of the church might have felt neglected in where that kind of path was going, and wanted to recognize the music as a use case of healing and just bring it where it was needed. So in that way, I keep bringing up UR, I keep bringing up underground resistance, because that's what they speak to almost directly, which feels very important to me. So I just try to carry that through.
Beautiful, absolutely. So, wow, we're having a conversation. I'll go there. And so, okay, this leaving the church and looking for something else in this different space. Essentially, right? In other words, it's like looking for God on the dance floor, right? Yeah. One could say. Yeah, which I find just fascinating as an idea, and I feel the same for myself. Like when I'm in that space, especially, you get into the zone. There's this thing happening. I've been aware of it for years now, but I remember, it took some time to realize this is taking me back to being 5 years old.
Yes.
In the church, and then you look around the club and you're like, but I don't think a lot of these people went to the Baptist church that I went to, and so what are other people tapping into? I wonder sometimes. But then, this sort of undercurrent maybe within the music as well that speaks to this sort of Southern Baptist church experience. I grew up also in that context. My mother was a preacher, so I wasn't so much behind, but I was getting a behind the scenes look at what went into someone writing a sermon, and in particular the performance, the translation of just some words typed out on paper to this thing that has people leaping from their seats. I was always very intrigued by that and its relationship to the choir. My whole thing at that time was that I wanted to be the drummer in the band, but funny enough, my family refused, and so getting turntables and playing loud music, I think, is my eventual revenge.
Do you remember why they were like, nah, not the drum dog?
It was just too loud. Small house,
Okay,
not a huge family, but enough that there was no space, none of that. My dad was prone to work doubles in a factory and come home, and it's one of those houses where he's like, he doesn't want to hear you walking up the stairs.
Right. So I
That vibe.
You briefly spoke of the typewriter, which makes me think of just another kind of drum, another kind of percussive object, that the kind of rhythm. And I wish I could be writing on typewriters more often, because there is something about the rhythm of that when you kind of get into a certain flow state and the little hammers aren't kind of crossing in and getting stuck, that you're playing it like an instrument, and that kind of, I don't know, atonal pulse can almost push you right past what you think you're even going to type.
Absolutely. I mean, it is, I think, like an instrument. I still like to work with the typewriter, and I would add that that's exactly how I shoot all of my work still on analog film. And it's the same thing. If I'm holding my camera right here, I can hear the camera, rotating around. I can literally hear the images being taken at a 24th of a second, and it's a rhythm. It's a tune, like it's something. And if there's something odd, the camera is wiggling around in the gate, I can hear the difference in that. Maybe the frequency's higher or lower, depending. But it's a rhythmic thing. You stop, the sound stops, so forth. And there's really something, I think, beautiful about analog technology in that sense, that there are definitive rhythms, which again takes us, I guess, back to where you started with these work songs, right? That hammer, yeah.
Right. Work songs going up to the factory, the industrial and the agricultural really having a bit of an opacity between them. There's a lot of thoughts that are running by me, and I want to play a song, but just
please,
quickly, because you said that your mother was a preacher, and I just love the idea, at least for me, coming from a kind of church culture that is extremely patriarchal, and they seem almost indebted to the masculine form or the shape to be the leader, to be in the pulpit, to be in front of the lectern. Thinking about then your connection with Alice, and although you may not have met, it seems like this shape of a sort of spiritual leader in a feminine form, or taking that shape, seems to be following you throughout life. I don't know if you have any reflections on that.
And not too many I'll share here right now, but absolutely, yeah. I mean, growing up with my mother in that context, it was highly unusual. She in fact started an organization called Women in Ministries just because she didn't know too many other women, and so and she would travel a lot, and so she was often the first female preacher that people, so people would really, just were kind of shocked by it. I even remember being like, are people still going to go into trances? Because it's, again, thoughts even as a little kid, thinking will it still work the same, but not understanding why. And then the sort of normalization of that for myself, certainly I think it has a large part, in being drawn to people like Alice, who also came up in a very sort of, Baptist, actually not so much Baptist, but anyway, religious, Black Christian context. And feeling very comfortable with that. These weren't things that I would have thought of. The word feminism never came up in my house, never. But that my mom was always that sort of presence in terms of, writing, doing more sort of intellectual activities within the house, this sort of thing. And so, that was something. She also used to sew a lot. And so it was a lot of clickety-clack sounds in the house.
Right. Okay, so I have a song that I want to play. I was talking about You Are, so I was going to play something. It's High Tech Dreams, came out in 2007. And even when I was pulling this up while you were talking, to me this is trying to, there's an Ishmael Reed quote that comes to me where he talks about jazz, where he says we consider it a kind of storytelling. And to me, you're talking about how you want to bring the sort of daw of reason, or I used Ableton, but before that I feel like I got caught up in the Fruity Loops situation, but then bringing that sort of syntax into a different medium like film or writing. I love this idea of, making a movie like a mixtape or a DJ set like an essay or a song like a short prose piece. And to me, again, the song is called High Tech Dreams, and I can share a bit of it. Well, one, I want to talk about the literal writing on it. So on here, etched in the matrix runout grooves, this was something that happened at National Sound Corporation in Detroit, ran by Ron Murphy, who was kind of was a Motown lacquer cutter, but then after Motown left in '74 from Detroit to LA, a lot of the vinyl pressing companies and those who cut dub plates in Detroit were kind of, lost of an industry, of an economy, and it was really the techno push in the late 80s and 90s that helped continue the vinyl industry, which is now thriving predominantly at Archer Records and Third Man with, what's his name, Jack White. And what Ron let them do, because he wasn't pulling from the European lacquer cutters, that you could manually etch in certain things, and so he would allow for the handwriting of Mike and all the other people. So right in the Matrix runout, it says you need the hi-hat inside of here. And to him, he believes the hi-hat to be this kind of spiritual manifestation. Like once a hi-hat comes into a beat, it takes it to that next level. And so he's thinking about the hi-hat as a way to, one, try to consider dreams or high-tech dreams that Detroit once had. And then by the time this came out in '07, obviously techno was getting a bit of a resurgence, but back then at this time, it felt like it was done. And so in this way, you kind of hear the dream of what techno wanted, and then there's these moments of the reality or the nightmare that Detroit was or is for a lot of people that were here. So yeah, let's take a listen.
Preachers coming. 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 Preachers coming.
From a time in your life when you will ask
Preachers
yourself a
coming.
series of questions.
Preachers coming.
Am I happy with who I am?
Am I happy with who I am?
Am I happy with the people around me?
Am I happy with the people around me?
Am I happy with what I'm doing?
Am I happy with what I'm doing?
Am I happy with the way my life is going?
Am I happy with the way my life is going?
Do I have a life?
Do I have a life?
Or am I just living?
Or am I just living?
Do not let these questions restrain or trouble you. Just point yourself in the direction of your dreams. Find your strength in the sound and make your transition.
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 I spend too much time thinking and not enough doing? Did I try my hardest at any of my dreams? Did I purposely let others discourage me when I knew I could? Will I die never knowing what I could have been or could have done? Do not let these doubts restrain or trouble you. Just point yourself in the direction of your dreams. Find your strength in the sound and make your transition. Make your transition. Make your transition. There will be people who will say you can't, but you will.
You will.
There will be people who will say, you don't mix this with that. And you will say, watch me.
Watch me.
There will be people who will say, play it safe. That's too risky. And you will take that chance and have no fear.
No fear.
You won't let these questions restrain or trouble you. You will point yourself in the direction of your dreams. You will find the strength in the sound and make your transition. Make your transition.
Haga tu transición.
Make your transition.
Haga tu transición.
Make your transition.
Haga tu transición. Haga tu transición. No dejas estas preguntas preocuparte. Nomás púntate en la dirección de tus sueños. Encuentra fuerza en el sonido y haga tu transición. Haga tu transición. Haga tu transición. Haga tu transición. Haga tu transición.
that machine in literally a year. You made me bring the 404 out, but I had a fire in my studio about a year ago, and I had to put everything away, throwing stuff all over the place to get it out of harm's way, and in the process I ended up packing up all of my samplers and whatnot, and we were talking earlier this week, and I was like, you know what, like, I need somebody to tell me to take this thing out and bring it somewhere, so thank you for bearing with me on this working out. I had no idea what samples were actually even on there, but maybe we can talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I really wanted to talk about one. This phrase came to mind for me when you were doing what you were doing, black syntax or protocol. Again, we haven't spoken too much about the inheritance, but there seems to be a very disciplined protocol, or the idea that there is a structure to go about this, and we can do what we want inside of that structure, but there is a framework, and I think that it seems very apparent to me, we were talking about architecture, is that we do want to understand and get a sensibility of the context that we're in, but it doesn't necessarily preempt us to behaving in a certain way. We just acknowledge the space to kind of freak it, you know what I mean? So it feels like you're doing that. I was thinking about stitch work, you're talking about your mother quilting. I was hearing quilting happening. Like there might be a certain time where you want to double back on a certain thread and just kind of watch you go through the grid. And sampling just allows for this kind of nonlinear freedom of at any point you can return and get back to it. And even though you're in another part of the circle, it doesn't feel so jarring. Or the jarring is what's exciting. And you were talking about how you found filmmaking in the same kind of frequency, or you found a resonant frequency in that kind of approach. In that moment, what feels cinematic to you? What feels like editing to you? What kind of moments do you feel like drift between the two fields?
Sure, what I was just doing is probably one of the least cinematic fields for me. In fact, that's what I love about the 404. It's very freeing in that you're doing a type of programming, working within a grid, but generally you're just punching in the samples by tapping the buttons and then chopping them up. And so the feel of it is very much to the person making the samples. And so I feel like it's a very visceral, direct thing, whereas for me, cinema is a kind of slow burn process in a lot of ways. But the piece where, the editing piece, I think, is where there's that overlap. But that's happening more at the level of listening. And then, I'm listening to something, and I just hear something, and it's like, that's that snapshot, that clip that I want to pull from a wider thing. But I think when I get to the point where I'm putting something together for a project, like my last art book, there's a vinyl 45 in the back. And at that point, I kind of think of because I just take fragments of things, like I was just kind of messing around, or sometimes I'm just intrigued by a particular sound. And I'm not trying to go for a particular rhythm, but just exploring that tone. But that kind of gets organized and distilled into things that feel more concrete. And so then maybe some of that will end up on the final sort of, I'll call it product. But to me, it's the sort of counterbalance to this slow, like the film I'm making now, making a film on Don Cherry, trumpet player, multi-instrumentalist. I've been doing this for years, it's just slow, and you're fundraising, and you're waiting to get money, and then, you go, you shoot, and it takes months to do things, whereas this is a very direct thing. But as opposed to Reason, this to me kind of gets back to like actually playing something, whereas with Reason I would sometimes work with MIDI, but essentially I'm dealing with the grid. And it's the same thing, like we talk about Dilla with, Dilla's great contribution, right? Is he kind of broke down the grid while never getting out of it at the same time, which is just fascinating. It never gets old for me to listen to his music and think about the kind of basic tools that he's working with, and out of all the possibilities and all the people that came before him, that he was the one that was kind of able to bring a very definitive kind of swing to the grid, So it's a fascinating subject, and I mean, to me, it just speaks so much to blackness in general, right? Dealing with this sort of restricted lifestyle where there's a grid of whatever, sort of imposed on you. Nonetheless, you have to make something out of that, and not only make something out of it, but constantly we're adapting, thriving, and inventing things, right? Techno, et cetera, it's all a part of that. But on another level, not in a political sense of it, but aesthetically, that constraint, that's the sweet spot for me. It's like you're saying, it's the blips and the clips in the 404 that sometimes interest me when I'm playing alone anyway, or casually, something like this, where I could probably clean that up for like something that was being sold or whatever. But that, the fact that the samples blend and bleed on top of each other and all that, fascinating to me with a machine like this.
To continue the topic of cinema and kind of its barrier of access, working with the SP, it's really beautiful that you can kind of just go in the studio or just kind of, it's on the table, it's so available for you to kind of express yourself in the depths of where it allows you to. I keep considering techno as almost like a culmination of some kind of, almost like a Detroit Marxism of like, we want to own the means of production. We're tired of going to the studio and like buying hours, to get this stuff done. As consumer products become more and more available. Roland back in the 80s, that was pawn shop gear. It was not this prized possession that we're treating 909s and 404s and all of that too, but
it's still pretty cheap.
Shout out. But I really love this idea of black art being so available that we don't have to, overtop the means of production. But you're working within cinema as much as you're working within music. How do you make sense of the two? It feels like the barriers of entry to produce a film, especially for the kind of mundane or sort of dry long so stories of blackness, it almost becomes a gate keeping us away.
Absolutely. I mean, filmmaking changed my life for better and worse in a lot of ways, but so much of being a filmmaker is essentially a business, social proposition. You have to go out, you have to make people feel comfortable giving you large sums of money, and then my films are experimental, so I'm not promising anything, it's like I don't have necessarily a proper script or whatever. It's like, it might work, it might not, give me $50,000, and that's the game you play. And so the way I dress, everything about me essentially had to change, like when I became a filmmaker. And it's not an art form I really recommend people getting into because it's full of compromise and often there's no payoff. And so what you've seen these meetings, like inside of my studio, so my studio at home has 10,000 records, right? And so I sit down there with my 404 and it's like, I can world build for the rest of my life just sitting there. But for me, I don't know how else to explain it other than cinema came as a calling. It's like a commitment that I have to this thing, but it feels like a slightly abusive relationship, but I don't see myself getting out of it anytime soon. And when it works out, but it's just like the music, I think, keeps me sane in that. And so they balance each other out in that sense. That being said, I think a lot of my theoretical ideas about filmmaking pretty much come from my own interpretations of jazz music, more so or equally, to the influence of actual film theory. And so for me, I think my comfort with my films, like I shoot my own films, literally I shoot them myself. To me, that's like a type of music making as well, but it's very removed from what I'm doing. Actually, I don't even consider this for myself music making. I'm collaging, I'm quilting, but that I try it frees my mind creatively when I think I'm not. I say this isn't actually this isn't music per se. It's just organized or disorganized sound.
Yeah, it's like braiding. I've been thinking a lot about DJing. It's kind of like an act of braiding. Even listening to the music inside of a single song. The polyrhythms of it, it feels like there's braiding happening, and then it kind of fractals out to where there's braiding happening between like a B2B, and we're kind of trying to find each other's pockets, and how we can keep this going, and we can stop whenever we want to. It's kind of this infinite, opportunity that whenever we're done quilting, we can just put the tools down and we can pick it back up when we want to.
Exactly, it doesn't have to amount to this grand thing. It's almost sad to finish,
For sure, maybe it never does.
And I want to maybe go back to the last track that I feel like it speaks to some of this stuff. The last one that I played There's a cinematic tie-in and a church tie-in. It was a track by Theo Parrish, Preachers Coming. Some of you may know, imagine you do know, Theo's another one who's the son of a church family, which I just feel like when I listen to his music, that expectation, and just when he, talks or performs, there is that, music isn't, it's not just entertainment or something you get high to, but there's something transcendent that's supposed to happen, not like it might happen, but that's, you do it until you get there with the music. But I've always been fascinated by his sound. He was, for me, the gateway to getting deep into techno, because his sound is so not jazzy in the sense of like when you think of jazz music, but the equivalent, the techno equivalent of jazz for me, and the looseness of it. But also, like a lot of people, the way his tracks, again, this sort of geological sense of time build, like you have to spend time with them, they move in music.
It's depositional.
Yes, absolutely. So back to this track, it has all the Theo Parrish feels, but there's something really interesting. Another thing I like about Theo Parrish is the way he buries his samples. Often people didn't know that he sampled music, but this sample that, right? Church piano, hand claps, Preachers Coming. Professor C's in the house. Anybody know the sample? No? Very interesting.
And you can also hear he's like the conduit between Chicago and Detroit.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He's tying a whole lot together. It's the church, it's house, it's techno, it's jazz, right?
It's so loose.
It's almost that sample all the way through. And funny enough, that sample's from a film called Coonskin. Anybody familiar with
Yeah.
Okay, be careful how you woo Coonskin in certain places. Fascinating film that I'll go as far as to say that I admire. But what's interesting to me is also that it's a film made by a filmmaker named Ralph Bakshi, and it's supposed to be a parody of Song of the South, which was a racist Disney film, essentially a musical set on a plantation, where the song Zippity Doodah that people know, that comes from this racist Disney film. So Ralph Bakshi got this idea to make a sort of blaxploitation version of this film with Brer Rabbit, this figure that comes from the South to New York to kind of take over the underground crime scene. It's an animation cartoon. But nonetheless, it's a very controversial film, and it was boycotted by a lot of black organizations, etc. And for me, as far as cinema, the edit, and even theoretically, it's like I can't imagine he sampled this without knowing exactly what he was sampling, and that, like you're saying, this sort of, you turn his deposition, right, is a sort of investigation into this sound, these tones, and kind of reappropriating it back into something and infusing a certain joy in it. But at the same time, as like a cinephile, you're like, he's saying something to me very directly, and this was an experience that I had, go back to earlier in the conversation, with like Mad Lib. So anyway, there's this whole thing, irregardless of the sample, that just has this deep church feel, and then you add to that the sample itself. And then I think about just this process of sampling, just like taking something like that and really just like, like beating the shit out of it so you transform it, and it becomes like this transcendent thing. But to me, these are these sort of, like we were saying before, these sort of circles that kind of go around and around that. To me, like I'm just fascinated by that, like this conversation he's having with himself, maybe with the church. I'll even hold up the sticker, if you look here, right, it's a hand, black hand holding a tambourine. And so, all this stuff that we're sort of riffing on, it's all very much contained in here. And I feel like sometimes when I'm talking about sampling film and music, it sounds all kind of esoteric or possibly even nonsensical. But then something like this, for me, makes it all make sense. He's like making me feel sane.
Right, we have to build each other's citations for each other, We really help each other, help see the other. Okay, I feel like we could keep talking, but I really want to give some space for the crowd. If there's any questions you may have, I'm already seeing some friendly faces. I'm realizing I'm looking up for the first time. Hi. Well, one, thank you. I really appreciate this moment with you. It means so much.
Thank you. I mean, what a treat, and what a great space to do this in. This is great.
For sure. And if there's any questions, please raise your hand. You don't have to come up. I don't think we have a wireless mic, so come on down if you got something. Or shout it out and I'll just reply. I mean, I can see the person in the back, so there's no reason to walk over. We got one. What's up? Hi.
This is really cool. I don't really have a question per se, but you guys were making reference to Summer and kind of Detroit and excited by nothing in this in music. And it made me think a lot about The Last Angel of History. I'm always referencing that film every chance I get.
Yeah.
And just thinking about, you were saying something about someone said blackness is, like, it's all blackness using different technologies, different things to make sound from technology. I don't know what that quote was, but it's reminding me a lot of that, just thinking about like the ideal of blackness being technology, and our job is to go back and bring it to the future, to go back to the past and always bring it to the future. And I really think about like that. It's, to me, that gets me really excited to think about just like limitless blackness. It's like almost like collapsing in on itself, like opening out the past and future, but we keep doing that forever. It's just how we keep it going. So it is the same thing. It's just really like taking it and moving it forward.
Yeah, I'm just saying, you're spitting facts. I was just listening for a second. Absolutely, I think it's really beautiful that there is a form that denies form, or that it's a framework to allow us to consider what technology is away from the materiality of technostructure in general. So when I do hear techno, I'm also hearing blues, but when I hear blues, there's more than hearing the materiality of the string or the guitar. There's like a sensibility, there's an effort, there's an approach to blackness that precedes the tool, is what you might want to do with that tool. Even the idea that you can do something else with that tool, that idea of like self-determination, self-possession, we're just using these different conduits to get at something that has been inside of us. I'm thinking of I think it's a Fred Moten quote, to refuse, was it? To be refused, the refusal of being refused or something like this. And I really love this idea. I think it's prominent throughout Black music, Black cinema as that is a project. All of these are ongoing projects, but deeper than the sort of characteristics that, define the idea of Black music. It feels like the term is really trying to get at like accosting or an approach to say, what is music? And then you put blackness into it and it can recontextualize your idea of music in general. And it's not just use a B flat or like work within these chord structures. It's like, no, what does it mean to make music Black? What does it mean to like make opaque certain predetermined fields that we consider noise, sound, or music? Blackness wipes that slate clean. I love what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as it relates to sort of DJing, for me, like you can play that, it's like I can, you can move through these different times, and this is always what gets me in trouble with my sets, where it's like, based on what you're saying, it's like I'm playing blackness, but people are like, how could you be playing Miles Davis and then be playing techno? But that was techno, and then, jazz, and so forth, and, blues, so forth. And so it's like blackness as catalyst as opposed to, these sort of, the very tangible qualities to the music, or it swings or doesn't swing, and this sort of thing, which is interesting to think about, but that ultimately it's, how is, this idea of blackness impacting these mediums, and for me, that's the heart of the matter, always. And so the music, the technology, it comes from everywhere, but what makes it so that it almost always seems that there's something about Black culture that's activating it, right? We didn't invent trumpets or saxophones or drums, none of it, nonetheless, the main innovators, what is that thing, and that's something that I think is, right, I can show you better than I can tell you, it's like, you can play that, you can illustrate that really beautifully, and I think in a lot of ways. Thank you for saying that.
We have time for one more question. Behind me. What's up?
There's so much that I have so many questions about, but specifically I want to talk to the topic of, I think I grew up in a Black Baptist church, Southern Baptist church, and so that really struck a chord with me. I'm curious what has been your shift in creating music and sharing music from like when you first kind of realized, oh, I love putting this forth. What is your relationship in terms of this conversation of realness that you're talking about through the church, but also guiding people through what I think is a process that churches do, is like guiding this transformation of grief into something that is hopeful. I'm very curious what your ties are to that, between your start and today.
I can speak to that, I guess, a little bit musically speaking. I think when anybody, when you're first getting involved in art, or whatever your chosen medium is, it's all about getting gigs and performing. Like, you just do what you gotta do, you know? And I feel bad for, like, you know, no disrespect at all, but like, I feel bad for digital DJs, because it's like, you have no excuse to not be playing. You know, someone's gonna just, you know, I need to hear the latest or whatever. You can play it, you know what I mean? You know, but when you're DJing with vinyl, you really like, all that I have is what's in this box right here. And over the years, you know, like, you know, at first, you know, I came up in the hip hop culture, so it was all about like these 12-inch singles, and you would go and buy what you want, and then you would basically go buy like bootleg versions of the popular songs. You'd have to balance all that out. As I became more comfortable, more stable financially in other ways as an artist, for me, the money, none of that's important in terms of just buying stuff, but that there's a leverage there, because now I can say, well, I'm only going to play gigs where I can go deep into the music in the way that we're talking about it right here, right now. And so, for the most part, I mean, for years, I ran my own party, and you know, it was very explicit. You know, the party's called Botanica, Vinyl Healing, and Good Vibes. And all the details, very clear what you were getting involved in, and we did it, you know, no pun intended, but religiously. You know, the first Saturday of the month, every Saturday, and there was an energy that was, I think, kind of built around that, which all kind of got destroyed by the pandemic. And so since then, you know, sometimes I feel like I'm being very choosy about, you know, my sound or where I play and this sort of thing. I don't play as much as I used to, but I just feel like I'm at a point now where I just can't do stuff like that in vain. It's just doesn't feel good, you know, for me anymore. And so I'm very, very, very careful about what I say yes and no to.
I may have misunderstood your question, but how I understand the church in how it uses music as a technology to help cope with grief, but trying to transfer that into different spaces is really, you said something that I need to sit and think with, which is to have high expectations of the music, but it's also to treat what I feel like the music is doing in a phenomenological sense, to try to contextualize that into a certain series of values or ethics or gestures. So if I'm thinking about techno working through recursion, iteration, congregation towards the ideals of sublimation, where that last techno track I heard so much like Funkadelic, I heard so much Parliament. I mean, I was bringing up Mike Banks, the guy that made that song, and he was a studio session musician for Parliament Funkadelic before they went to LA, and so there is that literal continuity there, but also the way music brings people together in how we can signify certain collective or communal meanings in the music or with the music. I realize that it doesn't have to be beholden to a certain culture that no longer served me or saw me, or I stopped seeing it, but that doesn't mean that the technology inside of that culture is also kind of, you know, fraught or I don't want to say rotten, that's going a bit too harsh, but it's still worth investigating on its own merits. And so when I recognized or was given the knowledge of this kind of through line with not just gospel blues, because coming from Louisiana, I already knew that, but starting to recognize it through house and techno and garage and two-step, where prior to that, I was just into it from like, you know, a video game music sensibility, like, oh man, what are these sounds? But when I recognized that those roots were in Black culture, I was like, wait, I can use this. I mean, this whole event is called Living Equipment, and it really is a certain understanding, or not a capitulation, but an acknowledgement of this is here to help us deal with life, and it feels appropriate to take that almost on formal terms to see how far my life can be saved by music, by also respecting it and not towards manipulation or ego, which again I think the Black church is kind of spiraling through. And techno too. I mean, this is not a perfect thing. If you ever go to Detroit, I mean, you know, that's hustlenomics. You know, like 101 is Detroit, Michigan. So people use it and abuse it, but if you do that, it'll bite back at you. So I do think that there's also a spiritual thing going on with how much you might extract the use case of it. How much are you respecting it, and how much are you respecting yourself?
Just to add one last thing, how happy are we, right? We forget about happiness sometimes, right? You know, it's
Joy,
like grinding
catharsis.
out, doing things for money, the ego that says, no, I'm the thing, that person there is not the thing, like that. It's very self-destructive, and I'm speaking of myself as included, and it's like getting to a point in life where you recognize, like, you know, you're mostly just harming yourself with that sort of, you know, doing things for other people, trying to have this egocentric, I'm the only one kind of thing. It's just like, ultimately serves no purpose, and always reminding myself about that. But I think it's hard to feel that way and think that way when you're trying, you know, when you're coming up, you know. So it's like, it's easy for me to say that now, but if you would ask me 10 or 15 years ago, I don't know what I would say.
It's an alluring thing, so you have to be mindful. And on that note, thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you. We have one more of these tomorrow at Night Moves. Is it 5? Is it at 7? Is that 6? Okay. 5. Tomorrow at 5 at Night Moves. It'll be with Jesus Elia Reyes and Yulon Grant, otherwise known as Lorinex and Shy Boy. And there'll be more esoteric conversation around Black electronic music. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
That was fun, man. Just kept kind of